T-minus 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Booster ignition and liftoff.
Live from somewhere deep in the Freedom State of Florida, it's the Let's Be Frank Show with your host, Frank.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. I'm glad you guys are joining me for another edition of our Freedom Stream on Tuesday night. And this is a pre-recorded one, so I'm going to be very transparent. But in order to make this happen and make it to work, to have a great guest here tonight joining us, Miss Sarah Kane, joining us to really discuss what's happening over in the UK. I don't know how many of you guys have been following it, but it's been seeping into the places like Twitter and other places. And of course, the mainstream media has given it a complete blackout here in the States. And so come on and talk about a little bit about that, or a lot about it, to be honest, is Sarah Kane. Sarah, thank you for joining me tonight on the Freedom Stream.
Oh, thanks for having me, Frank. It's always fun. You know, we've been doing this every once in a while for several years now. I've come on here, and honestly, we always have a great time and a good conversation. So thanks for the re-invite. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever a specific topic comes up where I feel as though I'm not the best student sometimes to really give my entire take, because we all have takes. I can give a take on just about anything. But when you have someone that's a little bit more knowledgeable about it, I love to bring them on. Like I had Rob on just recently to talk about something that Rob was just passionate about. And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to bring Rob on. Rob knows all about this. Yeah. And so I know I mentioned to the audience on Saturday night that you would be here tonight to talk about what's happening in the UK and kind of what led to that and what's currently going on and how the government's reacted to it. And even to an extent to they're now warning the rest of the world, don't you be talking about this either. So, I mean, there's a lot to kind of unpack here. So let's go ahead and just get off. Let's just go ahead and open the first thing up here. What is happening over in the UK? Because I know there's a lot of people that are kind of wondering, maybe getting conflicted messages of what's happening there. What is happening, Sarah?
Well, there are riots happening in dozens of cities throughout England and even spreading into Northern Ireland. And there was essentially there was one catalytic moment, a spark, you might say, that has set off this recent round of riots. And that was when there was a stabbing in Southport in England, which is a city. And that stabbing was when the son of two immigrants from Rwanda attacked and stabbed a bunch of children, like 6, 9 years old, really young children who were at like a Taylor Swift dance class. So it was apparent 3 of these really young kids died, and there was like another 5 who were stabbed and are still recovering. And hopefully recovering, I should say. So that resulted in a lot of rage. And what you have to understand is that England has been kind of a boiling pot for a while because of immigration policies from a specific part of the world that does not merge with British culture. You know, from the Middle East, from the Muslim world, these people come over with their own religion and culture that does not merge, and they do not want to merge, right? There's no attempt to embrace or to acclimate with English culture. And so you've had this sort of environment going on for really decades now, where you essentially have 2 populaces that are at various degrees of war. Now, the British people, I think it's fair to say, have been pretty patient considering the number of terroristic attacks that have happened, you know, over the last just even like decade, I suppose, but certainly 2. When you can go, you know, back to the 7/7 bombings, there's the Lee Rigby attack, where it was the British soldier who was like beheaded basically in British streets by Islamic terrorists who are quoting the Quran while they do so. And again, these are people who are brought in by the British government, officially. There's the Westminster Bridge attack. There's the Manchester Arena bombing that you may remember, because that made American news, because it was the Ariana Grande event. There was the 2 different London Bridge attacks. I mean, it's just like one thing after another. There was the member of Parliament, David Amos, who was stabbed as well, because you don't have gun crime, because guns are completely banned and everyone's disarmed, but that doesn't stop people from dying, right? You still have the knife crime. You still have these different bombings. Knives aren't legal, bombs aren't legal, but it doesn't change the fact that when there's somebody who's malicious, these events happen. And then, of course, probably the most emblematic event showing these different, like the lack of cultural merging, was the grooming gangs. Okay, so that was where you had gangs of these Muslim men who would target English girls specifically, right? They weren't just like who's young and who can we target. No, they would actually target British girls, because they considered them essentially a lower class, less valuable, and they would quote the Quran in sentencing. But in any case, these gangs would groom and rape these girls who were typically 13, 14 years old. But what made that in some sense worse was the fact that the police did not arrest these individuals.
Right.
And what happened is, for over a decade, police heard about and received these stories and then looked the other way and refused to make arrests. And this is where the real rage came in, because there were thousands of British girls who were victimized in this way. Thus, there were thousands of rapists who were engaging in this sort of organized crime spree that wasn't treated, because police were afraid of, as they put it, upsetting community relations, being perceived as racist or being perceived as anti-immigrant. And so for that reason alone, these rapes were allowed to continue. And so you had this just fermenting rage amongst the British, people. So every once in a while, there's a sort of cataclysmic, moment, I guess you could say, a spark that just people say, okay, we've had enough. And that's what you had with the recent stabbing in Southport. So in response to that, you, of course, had some of these British protesters who came out in force against the immigration policies that they perceived had led to this. And there was some fake news at the time about, the guy being a brand new immigrant who came over, and that's simply wasn't the case.
Right.
But I think it was part of the spark and the rage. So British people came out to protest the immigration policies. At the same time, you had the anti-protesters, however you want to call them, sort of Hope Not Hate, Antifa group, some of which have actual communist flags, others have Antifa flags. It's that group, whatever you want to call them. They exist in American cities too, unfortunately. Yeah. And then you have a third group, which is interesting, which is the Muslim group themselves. So you have this these groups of Muslim men who are calling themselves the Muslim Defense League, or the MDL. And what's interesting about this group is that they've been showing up armed. And again, in England, I think it's hard for an American to sort of get their head around the legal landscape in England, but they are not legally allowed to own guns, to have knives, or to even have pepper spray. You just don't have an ability to defend yourself in England. You don't have a legal means to do so. And so to see these Muslim men with these swords and curved daggers and stuff is what is going on? And there were all these different videos that you'll see, especially on X. You don't see too many of them on other platforms at the moment because of censorship. And they're just walking around and they're attacking, in many cases, these I guess younger white men in their 20s, because they just see them as the enemy. And I think there's been this sort of what really is a cultural and religious issue is being perceived as a racial one, because people in the Middle East look differently to people who are English ethnically, right? And so I think it's just all okay, so he's Muslim, because he's brown, and so it's being perceived as a very racial ethnic thing, even though the underlying reality is that it's absolutely a religious and cultural clash that we're experiencing. But all these riots, I mean, this isn't just, it started as one, it started in Southport, but now you have these riots in just dozens of cities throughout England. And yeah, you're right. The American media is basically ignoring it and pretending it isn't happening, which is wild considering the scope of what's going on.
Yeah, no, it's wild to imagine, and not really, because we have kind of what that's happening here in the U.S. with the border wide open, where we have, so many people coming across daily. But in England's case, and much of Europe, it's a willingly bringing these people from the African continent, if you will, that have, like you mentioned, a completely different culture and religious background, and trying to merge these two groups together. And the insanity of it is that it seems like the government, especially there in the UK, is what we're speaking about, is being more hostile to the natives of England than they are the people that are coming over there in England. And
Right.
it's being perceived, and maybe there is some truth to this, that they are much more lenient on those individuals coming from the African continent coming into. And I don't understand why. And this is the question I think maybe you can maybe talk a little bit about. Why would England import so many people from a different continent? Was there an issue with birth rates or things like that in England, to where they're like, hey, we need to bring more people over, but then we're not going to expect them to assimilate whatsoever? And that's a problem here in the U.S. too, where we have no assimilation at all, where people do not want to be American. They just want to be whatever they are as they come over here. And it's a problem. It's going to become more of a bigger issue in the future here in the U.S. Hopefully never like what's happening in Europe. But can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. I think that one of the differences between these different immigration waves, both of which are bad, is that, okay, so here in America, the sort of excuse for mass immigration is, hey, we're not having enough of our own kids, therefore we need a sort of worker class to be imported. That's the argument, and it's a bad argument. But in any case, that is what's said. In England, it's different, because the argument isn't being made that we need a worker class. In fact, you don't have a big manufacturing base. You don't have, it's like, there's just not even an argument there. Instead, the issue is that most Brits, especially in the higher political levels, don't think there's anything worth defending about British culture in itself. They don't think there's any reason for acclamation, because what you have is essentially an understanding of self-loathing, like not really an understanding, hey, what we have here as the English is distinct and is worth saving, and is in some ways better than something that we're importing. And if you don't have that, like if you can't say, hey, we have base values here that are good, and thing is, like, that they're so far on the left, so progressive, right, that they're unable to say that our culture is better than the one that we're importing, because that would be offensive. And so they had this sort of, and you had this on the far left here, it's the understanding that we should be tolerant except of the intolerant, which is really confusing. It doesn't actually make sense. It's kind of weirdly circular, right? So you should be tolerant of all these different, like, random cultures, regardless of how, like, crazy and hostile they actually are. Tolerant of them. It shouldn't be intolerant. You should be intolerant of the intolerant. So the native Brits who don't like foreigners, you should be intolerant of them, but you should be tolerant of those who want to, swing swords around in the streets. It's a very perplexing ideology, but it actually is something that I think is sweeping throughout the West. And so for that reason, you have sort of unwillingness to say, okay, that's enough immigration. We can't take it. We have this small landmass. I mean, if you look at England on the map, it's smaller than a lot of our state, right? It's not a huge locale. And yet, despite that, there's nobody at the higher political level saying, hey, we have reached a cap, or even this is what the cap would be. Nobody's willing to even make that argument because it's offensive to do so. Now, one of the things that's actually going on, the reason that you have so much immigration, is because what you have in England is a massive welfare state. And I've kind of often said, you can kind of have one or the other. You can have open borders, or you can have a welfare state. You cannot have both. Because if you have the welfare state, you attract most of the world, because you have a higher quality of life just provided for you without work than you have in most of the world, right? Now, you also have that is an acceptance of asylum seekers generically. Now, according to the original agreements that Britain got into with the rest of Europe, it was like, okay, we'll accept asylum seekers coming from the country that is in a state of war if I think one country over was the rule, because that made sense. Like you're the nearest available free body, I guess, where the person isn't actually at risk. It's a humanitarian attempt. However, they're coming from Pakistan. Like, I mean, you can count like how many countries you'd have to cross, to get from Pakistan to England, and yet that's what's happening. That they're coming from the Middle East over, crossing all of these different countries that are not at war to come to the place where they get the most like handouts in terms of welfare, and also then they're creating their own little pockets of community. So they're not trying to assimilate into British culture. Instead, what they're doing is creating no-go zones for native Brits, areas where a woman can't really walk around without wearing a hijab in this particular place of a city called Bradford, because it would be unsafe for her to do so. Now that's abhorrent and wrong. And it's like, I mean, imagine if you grew up in Bradford, as plenty of Brits did, right? Because it's an English city, and so did your parents and your grandparents. And now you're like, okay, it's not safe for me to raise my kids here, so I have to move as a result of the immigration. Like there's a degree, I think, of rage and resentment there that's difficult for most people to really relate to. I think that kind of gives you like a picture of just the degree of, okay, so I'm being like literally forced out into a different city and hoping that the same thing doesn't happen to the new spot that I'm at, because the policies that led to this are continuing.
Yeah, and we see that in just kind of from here in the U.S. we just see it kind of a surface level, but we see where now you have these mayors and a lot of the major cities across England now are foreign-born mayors. Now they're foreign-born. They're not even native English natives there any longer. They're leading. So now it helps them move more into a way to complement the countries that they were from versus what's best for all of Brits there in the country. What we see,
what happens?
Go ahead. Yeah.
What was kind of interesting about that is that the Muslim populace, because they believe it almost as a religious mandate that they need to vote, and that's kind of interesting. So when you have like these Muslims who move into an area, they vote at a rate of almost 100%. Now native Brits, they vote at about 30%. So if you have enough that move into this area, they can very quickly achieve essentially a takeover of the political level of that, the city council. And it really is kind of like shocking. And you're like, well, we don't have a majority of Muslims. Like, no, but you do in terms of voting.
Yeah.
So
voter turnout, very important. But again, like you mentioned, that I didn't know that how well they grouped together to vote. But now we see this reaction now because of the natives there in Britain. They're like, okay, hey, we're kind of fed up with nobody doing anything about this. Nobody willing to stand up and say, hey, we cannot continue to allow kids at this point now, kids being murdered on the street by people who weren't even born here. What steps are the government there now taking, because they are really restricting speech now? And is it just a broad section where whatever they feel they don't like to hear, they can arrest you? Or can you talk a little bit more about that?
Certainly. It really began at around 2007, where they passed the first laws against, as they called it, inciting racial hatred. Which I think to a lot of people, they're like, well, don't say racist things. Like a lot of young people in America, I think would respond like that. And it's like, well, free speech doesn't exist, so you can compliment kittens. But beyond that, it's like, okay, but when you're talking about inciting hatred, let's just ignore the word racial for a second. If you incite hatred is an emotion, right? So what you're really regulating there is how people's feelings of are affected by what you say. So it's like, do you really want the government to issue a ruling on the basis of the thoughts and feelings, not of you even, but of the thoughts and feelings of someone else who might receive your message feasibly and how they might respond to that? And essentially, that was the beginning. And from there, they basically have been expanding what is illicit, or I guess you'd say reducing what you can say legally, because now it's an offense to cause offense in England. And so that's, you know, again, it's about how would what I say be perceived by someone else. And basically anything that's worth saying can offend somebody somewhere and will, you know, but I mean, as a Christian, my point of view is if it's true, it ought to be said, right? People have the right to hear the truth, even if it's the truth they don't want to hear. And it's my obligation to speak that truth, right? That's kind of a pretty, I guess you could say, solid part of our faith, because, you know, the truth is Christ. Right. But over there, the entire thing is like, no, if you cause offense, it's illegal. And then at the same time, they are cracking down on anyone who like shares riot videos. So you can't figure out what's even going on, because they're saying that by doing that, you could incite other people to become angry. And so you see how they sort of like expand this causing offense to basically whatever they want, because they can tell you how somebody else might feasibly somehow, you know, receive this message. And it gives them such broad understanding of, we can basically lock you up for anything that you say, or any material that you have on your computer that can also be used against you to show what kind of person you are, and therefore that you're a terroristic threat because you're on the far right, you know, which they define according to how they want. But yeah, you're right. They've been targeting individual Brits who live in the country, who just, you know, share videos saying what's going on, who express political opinions that are, say, anti-immigrant, because that's offensive and therefore is illegal. And then, interestingly, the British government has been threatening social media companies in other countries, like here in the US, telling them to take the videos down because they're going to incite something as well. So it's the same kind of thing, but they think that they think they have a lot more power than they do. But I'll tell you, Frank, you know what it reminds me of? It was Elizabeth Warren a couple of years ago was threatening X, which then was Twitter, and telling them to take certain content down. And it was kind of, you know, I just think that it's interesting when our Democrat politicians over here are actually doing a lesser, but still the same version, or at least attempting to do the same version, because they have a very similar worldview, but less power, right? So it's like if these people were, you know, in the position that the British version of the Democrats are in, they'd be doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah, it's, you know, to talk about that point a little bit, they threatened Elon Musk for, you know, allowing people on Twitter to share videos and talk openly about what's happening over there, and threatening to arrest him. You know, they said this would all end if we could just arrest Elon Musk and shut down Twitter, right? Because free speech is a threat to democracy, or a threat to freedom. As crazy as that sounds, right? But you're right, because that happened here in the U.S. back in 2020, 2021, and even a little bit into 2022, where prior to Elon Musk purchasing Twitter, the U.S. government was telling Twitter and other social media companies what to take down regarding vaccine information, COVID information, election information, anything that was even could be critical of the current regime here in the U.S., critical to them. They were being able to have those users kicked off the platform, that videos taken down, people, you know, enduring strikes. You know, I know me, you, and a group of other content creators have been on the platform for many years, have gone through a lot of these fights through COVID, through the election, through the information from January 6th, and et cetera, et cetera. You know, you probably have a whole timeline, as much as I do, of things that we have been targeted for by these social media companies, and by conjunction by the U.S. government. But it's so much greater there in the UK, where I remember seeing videos back in 2020 during COVID, where they were arresting people for not wearing masks, where they were arresting people for sharing misinformation about COVID vaccines and breaking into their homes to arrest them, or they saw somebody without a mask and they broke into their homes to arrest them. And yet the criminality section in England or in Great Britain is allowed to continue to run rampant regardless of flaunting the law. As you mentioned, the gangs roaming with weapons and police officers standing there almost protecting them from from the people that are concerned about the guys that have the weapons.
Yeah, and there's even a video going around in which one of the law enforcement officers there has a megaphone. He's surrounded by one of these Muslim groups, and he's telling them to go put their weapons in the mosque. You know what I mean? Not I'm going to arrest you for. I mean, and it's wild because you see these videos in which the British police are like attacking and arresting like grandmothers and stuff because they said something offensive at a protest. And then you've got this guy who's like, no, go hide your weapons there, and we won't touch you because we don't want to make any arrests of you guys. You know, and it's like that kind of disparity in policing, that kind of, I guess, injustice built into the system will likewise cause such riots to continue because people can only take so much in terms of their tolerance for a system that treats them as a second class. And really, that's what you're talking about, is that the British people are institutionally being referred to and treated as a second class.
Yeah, and it concerns me to the point to how many actual Brits are tolerant to that type of discrimination by their own government, because there is a certain section within the British population, the natives there, that think it's okay. It's not going to happen to them if they, because we're not racist. We're not the intolerant ones, right? Sure. But how long until they decide whatever they may say is intolerant? And it's quite hilarious that they always target the far right. It's always the far right, never the far left. The far left never gets targeted at all, which shows you that they line perfectly up with the government with many things. They're useful idiots and foot soldiers on the ground. And what's happening there in England, I'm wondering, how long can this sustain? Is there going to be a tipping point to the point where citizens say enough is enough, and we need new leaders representing us? And will the British government try to do what they did to Donald Trump here in the U.S. by taking him off the ballot, unsuccessfully, by the way, here in the U.S., but the attempt was there? Would they be more successful in saying, no, that candidate that you want, like a Donald Trump candidate, for example, if they actually had something like that there, is way too far right. We can't have him on the ballots at all. Is that something that's feasible to be done there?
Yeah, I think that it is, and I think that it's happening. So, like, for example, I don't think there's a political party right now that I could point to and say, hey, that's the one in Britain that people should get behind and that is likely to actually have success. And the reason for that is because that someone comes out, with what I would consider realistic policies in dealing with this problem. Well, those policies are offensive and they're illegal. So, like, the British police can arrest someone who's engaged in that sort of political speech because that stuff is offensive. So I know there've been arrests of the leaders of Britain First, for example, which is one of the political parties there. There've been arrests of a lot of different activists from these organizations because they're putting stickers around town that have things that some people find to be offensive. And so it's so easy to subvert the political process by arresting the opponents. And that sounds like something that you'd hear in, a despotic place. But honestly, I think that's appropriate. Like it literally, England is a despotic place by any reasonable definition. Because when you're at the point of preventing people from speaking freely, preventing them from defending themselves, preventing them from really running for office and changing the way the government is run because they can't speak freely, I think that just kind of falls under despotism at that point. And the trouble with that is that when people don't feel like they can achieve change through political means, you reduce their options, and therefore you're going to have things like riots. And that's how things like civil wars actually start, is because people don't see another option. Nobody wants, well, very few people want that kind of a solution, almost like, put their life on the line and that of their families, of course, and like massive unrest. But when you give people no options, things like that are way more likely to occur, because people, everyone wants a good life for their kids, a better life for their kids. You can't say that for the people who've been essentially relocated or forcibly relocated out of places like Bradford, or for people whose daughters have been raped in cities from Leeds to Sheffield to Telford to Bradford. Like, what you're seeing over time is essentially the parent group, if you want to call it that, this age range, realizing that what they're leaving for their kids is a lot less than what they had. But their kids are going to have to live in some ways as a second-class citizen, to the Muslim populace or to the government, which are at the moment at least working in alliance. And over time, of course, becoming more Muslim. And I do think that it's interesting that this is happening. I think there's a sort of spiritual void in England because it's an atheistic country, and I think that makes it much more likely to have a religious replacement than it would be something like here.
Right.
But yeah, you absolutely have that happening, and people don't feel like they have a better solution, which is kind of tragic.
That is quite tragic. And as you mentioned, parents, I guess people of our age groups looking at what is being left behind for their children. It's almost reminiscent of the soldiers who went to fight in World War II, for example, coming home to their country to rebuild their country back. And now, maybe those that are left still from that era are looking at like, what happened to what I fought for is now being all destroyed, and being said that what we fought for was incorrect, and we should be, our monuments are being taken down now because they're offensive. It kind of, I think about it because it's happened here in the U.S. a little bit here and there in cities, that are predominantly ran by communists or Marxists or whatever. Like if you were to deface a street mural that's on the road, like a LGBT flag, that's on grounds of a felony charge. Hate speech that you can be arrested for. Or if you take a leaflet and post it on a thing that says it's okay to be white, that is also hateful, and could be charged as a felony because it's a hate crime. And it's just but you can
or stealing like an LGBT flag off of a church or something. It's like it goes from not just being like stolen property, like it would be with any other flag, but instead now suddenly there was a guy who got sentenced, I think it was in Washington State, to like something like 15 years for doing just that. He took a blasphemous LGBT flag off of this church and then burned it. And it's like, okay, so it's destruction of property and theft.
Right.
So ordinarily, he's looking at like less than 6 months, realistically speaking.
A misdemeanor.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But instead, no, he ended up getting like more than 15 years because it was a quote hate crime. And so that right there is the government essentially saying, okay, so on the basis of the thoughts that you had, we will evaluate whether the thoughts that you had, the intent that you had, was something that we like or something that we dislike, right? If you take a certain type of flag off the church, it's okay. If you take a certain other type of the of flag, then it's suddenly like egregiously wrong because the government what thoughts you're having. It's like it's difficult to see how that would not eventually lead to more, right? Because it's in its own right, I think. But it also is like if you accept the government's ability to judge what hate is and what hate is acceptable, because no one's ever attacked for non-hate, right? All fights involve anger, and so therefore, like you start with that. Well, it's the pretext for just about every other sort of like hate crime, hate speech, and so on.
Yeah. Not to that just brings me to mind. I think it was back in the 80s, maybe early 90s, where artists, I guess, submerged a crucifix into a jar of urine And
I remember.
I'm thinking today, right? He was hailed as a edgy artist, right? Oh, look at all these Christians that are outraged by that, and nothing happened to him, right? But if you were to take a LGBT flag, for example, and submerge it in a jar of urine, I'm sure you would be arrested.
Yeah, I know.
And it's quite ridiculous, and it's sad to see, our country move in that direction, but also England, which was a mighty nation for so long, right? It was a superpower, the biggest empire on earth at one time. Even in the early roots of England, they were able to fight back the Romans, which was the empire of that age. They were never able to really conquer all of England. So, I mean, from going from that to where we are today is quite sad.
It really is. And, I think that people also forget that so much good was done during those days of empire, if you want to call it that. Like, we think in such politically correct terms now that everyone's, anti any sort of colonialism and that kind of thing. But it's like, okay, but we also spent decades eradicating slavery around the world. Like, can we not just acknowledge that, hey, that was an act of good, that we spread the faith, that we spread law, order, education throughout the world? We stopped some of the most barbaric practices known to man, like
in India,
for some reason, always what comes to mind is, right. In India, we stopped them from
the wives
burning the widows. Yeah, exactly. Right. Your husband dies, so now you have to get on the pyre. Yeah, exactly, and burn.
And the British stopped that. They walked in there like, yeah, that's barbaric.
Yep. Like, yep, you can't do that. And they were very upset about the fact the British were stopping that as well. But yeah, so it's like practices like that, when the Brits came across it, different child sacrifices, like of kids who were less able when they were, born because they were, they had something wrong. We stopped them from just, in fact, we put an end to that where we came across it. So it's like there was some good there, and nowadays it's like because of the modern leftist ideology, it's like no, because they were. It's so racial. It's like basically because they were English, because they were white, and therefore it's bad. It's like, okay, that's a really shallow look upon history, and it's a look upon history that is devoid of values. It's like if you want to evaluate these things, then we can come at it and we can say, okay, let's look at the good and let's look at the bad on the basis of what they did. The whole widows thing in India, that was a good thing, because we have a moral standing, right? And we can sit here and say, okay, that was good. There are some things that they did that was not so good, and we can sit there and evaluate it. But when you just like broad brush it like that, it really is an attempt at destroying a person's like history, and I think that's a big part of what's going on in England. We talked about earlier how they've sort of like become unable to say that their culture is better than those they're importing, right? And therefore there's basically an unlimited wave of immigration, because why would you want to defend our own culture? Well, there's also this lack of understanding of, hey, we had a history, and I think it's parallel to analogous to what's going on in America with the pulling down of statues and so on. It's just like weird national self-shame.
Right.
So that especially so that the young of a country can no longer say, hey, there were people who fought to make this country what it is, to make this culture what it is, to give me the chance to do what I can to pass on this debt that I've got from my ancestors onto posterity, which is what we historically, that was how man would see himself, right? As receiving this massive gift from his ancestors in terms of like whatever he had, the culture that he had, the society that he lived in, the fact that he has to like hunt for food, right? The fact that that's what civilization is. Civilization prevents us from having to worry about how we're going to survive. So instead, we can focus on how do we thrive in different ways and grow, right? So to get coffee, I don't have to like find the grounds. I just literally press the go on the coffee maker, and I have a grocery store I can go to and get the stuff. This is civilization, and we should be grateful for all of those gifts that are passed down, because throughout like most of human history, it was a lot harder than it is now. And then because of our gratefulness, our gratitude, we should want to pass that on to posterity, to the future generations. And so this was the way that people typically saw themselves in the past. Now we're no longer seeing ourselves like that. Instead, the people of the past, our ancestors, were all villains right? They were all bad people who didn't ever produce anything that was good. And so we live in this state where there's nothing that's worth defending, because everything that you see is basically a remnant of some villain in the past who built it, and therefore it should be torn down, regardless of the fact that would make our society worse. Doesn't matter, because it's all just bigoted and evil. And then we don't really have much of a debt to pass on, anything to pass on to our young either, because what do we know about values? It's just so like relativistic. What would we know? What would we have? And really, like, aren't we just influenced by all these different bigoted attitudes ourselves? And so it's like, it's really self-destructive at like an individual and a societal level.
Yeah, it truly is. And it's like I said, it's just sad to see a great empire such as England to be where it's at today. And sadly, the U.S. isn't much better. The offspring of England isn't doing as well, because we are moving rapidly toward those types of ideals and goals for people that want to continue to have a populace that is self-loathing of its past, instead of looking to what good that this country has done for the rest of humanity, which has been quite a deal. And kind of just leads me to think about, this upcoming election, and not saying that electing Donald Trump is going to solve all of our problems here in the U.S., but if anything, it's going to stave off what, for at least for a few more years, as we continue to build coalitions, right, to try to combat this move toward something like in England. And what's your reaction to this whole thing with Kamala Harris being implanted as the Democrat nominee? And her, I just had a great guest on Saturday, Mike Nificent. He's from Minnesota, and so he knows all about Tim Walz and all of the gross stuff that Tim Walz is involved in. And Mike put it pretty simply: Minnesota is more California than California is California, and that's pretty scary. But what's your kind of reaction to all of this that's currently happening right now with them hiding her? She'll have no scheduled interviews until September. They're really doing a number to try to make her palpable for the U.S. for people in the U.S. to vote for her.
I can't help but find it hilarious, honestly. Like, maybe I've got a dark sense of humor, but it's like they chose a demographic. Like, they didn't choose, a person. They chose somebody who had the right skin color and the right sex. And that was it. And they're like, okay, so you fulfill these requirements. Nobody likes you, like on either side of the aisle, but we no longer care about that. We no longer care about policy and likability, which historically they were kind of important in politics, but not anymore. Now it's like they've embraced that particular ideology so much that they're just like a caricature of a person is being like, held up on the basis of demographics, which is kind of ridiculous. But I remember when she was in the primaries, back against Joe Biden. And I remember like her likability, I think was like 12% at the beginning, and then was like 5 at the end. So it's like the more people heard her, the less they liked her. And so it doesn't surprise me that now they're like, okay, let's not make that mistake again. Instead, we'll just avoid cameras. No one will know anything about her. And instead, they'll just vote for her because she fulfills these characteristics and because she's not Donald Trump. And so this strategy of, she isn't a human being, which is like, I mean, it literally is dehumanizing. She isn't a human being with, her own quirks and nuances and all this. No, she is a caricature of a person who fulfills our demographic desires, and she's not Trump. And therefore people will vote and just don't let anybody know anything about her, because the moment that they do, they're just going to just be like, no, I'm not voting. It's again, dark sense of humor, but I just think it's kind of funny.
You're not completely off, and because early voting happens so early here in the U.S., right? In so many different states, they go sometimes before the first debate's even done. And I know she's balking at some of these debate times that have been put up there. And my guess, this is just my guess, is that I think they're going to try to at least have the first debate after early voting has started. So therefore, they can capture some people already that are voting just based off of what the media has given her glowed reviews. I know the Time magazine just gave her like a full front cover of her and trying to make her into a Barack Obama-esque figure on there, was saying her time is now or something like that. It's reminiscent of Hillary Clinton 2016 campaign slogan, but I can't get over how much of the populace in this country is so dumbed down that they refuse to even think slightly critically about what's being fed to them by the mainstream media. For example, the whole tips thing, right? I'm not big into, okay, we're not going to tax the tips. Okay, great. How about we just not tax anybody then if we're not going to tax the tips? That's just my perspective. But I get it. I understand what Trump was doing with that. Then Kamala comes out, a couple weeks later. Oh, yeah, we're going to do the same thing.
Yeah.
Bro, you're the one that cast the final vote to tax the tips.
Yep. I know. I know. They don't seem to have any policies right now. Not really. I guess you could say not any that resonate with a large enough audience that they're willing to actually put them out there and be willing to defend them. And that's part of the problem. I mean, with the taxes, I think I'm with you. It's it's part of your income. So if we're going to do income, then it makes sense to do that. But right now, what we really need in terms of that is actually an entire tax reform. What concerns me about our tax system is that it's so convoluted and complex that the federal government, if it wants to use anything against you, they can always use the tax system. And I think it should be simple enough that it shouldn't be possible to use it as a form of persecution. And it really has been done so many times. It's we couldn't find the crime that we wanted them to be guilty of. Therefore, hey, this tax thing isn't done quite right, or we perceive it not to be. But it's so complicated that if they want to find a problem, they always can. And that
always can.
And that's kind of a huge threat to, I think, actual freedom. So I wish they'd just do a flat tax or something like that and just say, okay, we're done.
Yeah, no, for sure. What one thing that I have noticed with this campaign, for example, is that Trump just did a huge space with Elon Musk last night. It was so big, it literally broke the servers or whatever.
Yep.
Even though Elon said they tested and everything, Elon said that there was some type of attack on Twitter. There may have been. I knew the European Union was upset that he was hosting Donald Trump for whatever reason. They were upset by that. And then, of course, all the media. I know Jean Pierre got a question from a Washington Post reporter. Is there anything you can do to stop Elon Musk from talking to Donald Trump on this space? Right. Yeah. It's interesting because Elon Musk had given Kamala Harris the same opportunity, and her campaign refused to even sit down with him to have a conversation. Right. Wasn't even an interview, and that's what Musk was very upfront with. He's like, this isn't an interview, it's just a conversation so people can hear this candidate just talk like a normal person just about topics, right?
She's a career politician, though. Can she talk like a normal person? I mean, I'm just asking a question because I don't think that she actually get completely off the cuff without all these different people behind the scenes saying, okay, this is our policy, this is how we're going to state it, and be very careful to avoid. I don't think she could just sit there and have a conversation. I think that it's anathematic to who she actually is. Instead, she only sort of works in a very scripted political sense, and you get that feeling about her on those occasions when she does appear in front of the camera. It feels so inauthentic. If Trump had an opposite, it just would be, it would be Kamala Harris, because it's she seems so scripted, and he's we're gonna be the best. It's just it's just completely, it's just him.
At least with Joe, as much as he was a puppet, Joe is still Joe, right? He still he had those moments of him being angry or him using his weird analogies or whatever. He was, I don't want to say authentic, like a real person, but he's more real than Kamala Harris.
I know. She does seem so kind of contrived at this point.
It's you asked AI to create you a Hillary Clinton candidate that is black.
Yes. Precisely. And they've got it, and it's and I remember the Hillary Clinton campaign, and it was just the whole I think it was it I'm with her thing.
I'm with her, yeah.
Right. So the entire campaign was just I'm a woman. And it was maddening. So that we had all the different like spoofs on YouTube and stuff where she'd just say I'm a woman repeatedly. And they were also like, splice next to each other because that was her campaign. Like she didn't have any arguments. It was just like, I'm a woman, therefore vote for me. And then at the actual votes, I remember when the votes were coming in and they had like the video showing the lines of just different women as this historic, event for women. And it was so like, as a woman, it was kind of just so cringeworthy. I'm like, stop, please stop, like as if like she could just represent the, every woman everywhere by the fact that, she is female. It was horrifying. And they're doing the same thing with Kamala, right? Anybody who is not white, she must represent. Anybody who's female, like everyone has to get behind her. That's it. That's all she's got is the demographics and then
the identity politics.
Yeah, literally. She's just like incapable of having a normal conversation with a human being. I'd love to hear the conversation between her and Elon Musk because I think it would be painful, but in like a comical way.
I think so as well. I'm actually looking forward to the possible debate between her and Trump, because I think Trump can really push those buttons to really make the real Kamala come out. And really expose her. And then
she'd have the angry black woman demographic. She'd just
the angry black woman
caricature.
they would make a camp. The Kamala headquarters or whatever would make memes about it. Oh, she got the angry black woman thing. White man cannot stand up to an angry black woman.
Yeah, the internet would love it. That's all I'm saying.
Real quick, we got a little bit of time left. I know they just finished up there in France, the Olympics. Real quick, just a couple thoughts about the Olympics overall. You had the boxer who has chromosomes of a man, boxing in the women's division, wins the gold. You had the Olympics starting off with mocking, I don't know, a third of the world with their horrendous mockery of the Last Supper, with their drag queen, lesbian people. And then what was the other one? There was one other thing that was in there. The breakdancing lady who was the cultural professor at the university in Australia coming out. What's kind of your just thoughts of that whole thing in the last few minutes here?
And don't forget, of course, them swimming in water that handles human waste.
Yes,
of course. But
that's diversity right there.
Exactly. That's what I thought. Yeah. I think that the entire thing is summed up by the beginning. You know what I mean? Like it really just kind of set the mood of where their values lay. And so it's like if you just saw the introduction with the mockery of Christ and the mockery of Christians, it was like, well, what good is going to kind of come out of this event? Like just how kind of decadent and perverse will it appear? And it's like, 5 minutes later, effectively, you have a man punching a woman in the face and receiving a gold medal for it. You know what I mean? I think that it's kind of like when you set the tone like that, we should have kind of known what to expect. And so like the Olympics just kind of became this almost parody of itself at a certain point. And that was especially the case. Like of course he won the gold because he's a guy. Yeah, you know what I mean? Like he may have some issue with being intersex or whatever, but he's predominantly, has male characteristics. He's a guy. It's incredibly unjust that he would be fighting women at any point. And in a sane world, everyone would be able to say that. It's only because of transgender ideology and this perverse gender theory that anybody's ambiguous about how we should treat, somebody who is male and dominantly appears as male and has the characteristics that would give him an unfair advantage against women. Like, it's like I can have compassion for the fact that he's unable to fight against men because he's going to be weaker than most men. But that doesn't mean that he's, morally in a position where he can beat up women. And that's the error that's there. And there are so few people in positions of power who are willing to say so because of gender ideology. So the two things do actually kind of come in and intersect there. no pun intended, but that's the Olympics for you. And with them just sort of, gosh, the river, with them swimming in the river that was full
So
of human
gross.
waste. I mean,
So
it's
gross.
yeah, exactly. It's very French, but it is completely gross. So it's like the entire event, again, it just sort of became a bit of a parody at best and just disgusting at worst. And I mean that with both the Olympics and the river swimming.
Yeah, Napoleon would be appalled.
Yeah.
The greatest French leader ever.
Yeah. Yeah. So, certainly.
Yeah, it's been quite the summer. Truly has, with everything that's taken place politically, taking place culturally, and everything like that. It's been quite a summer, and the year's not even finished yet. We still got U.S. elections to get through, and then things after the U.S. election. So I know. Just real quick, is that one of the House members for the Democrat Party said they were going to, if Trump were to win, they were going to find a way to throw him out of office before he could be inaugurated.
Right.
So already Democrats not accepting the results of an election, it seems pretty on par for Democrats to do. Ryan, our buddy Drone Tech, is always up for talk about that. He's like, yeah, Democrats every year that they lost, it's always been stolen. But as soon as their guy gets it, no, it's the most secure election ever.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's a threat to democracy to, question the results of the election unless they're the ones that are doing it. And they're doing it beforehand. I remember when it was Hillary against Trump, that was one of her things, is you can't possibly question the results of the election. So that they made him, will you accept the results? And he's like, we'll see. They were completely upset about that, and then suddenly he wins and she's trying to get the results changed thereafter. It was like, that's the way that they roll, so to speak. At this point, it's like, no, they want their person in, and they don't really care anything about the Republic or the democratic process or any of that. It's just about preventing the evil Trump.
And they did the exact thing they charged Trump with the whole elector scheme thing, where they were trying to get the electors to flip and change their votes. They had Hollywood and everybody like pressuring these
all the celebrities.
Yes.
I remember the commercials, just cycling through these different celebrities who are begging the electors to flip their vote.
That's okay. That's okay.
Yeah, exactly. Like by our celebrity power combined. And what was really funny about that, they got to see how actually important they really are. Because I think these people live in this world where they're basically worshipped, and so they think that they have a certain degree of power because they're playing people on screen, and people like that and they find it entertaining. And then suddenly they try and mess with the regular world, and they're like, oh, we actually don't have power. And so I kind of particularly amusing because I can just imagine those people in that position psychologically, and they're just like, they think they can change the election after the fact. And it's like, no. Hollywood doesn't actually control the country.
Yeah, no, for sure. Sarah, it's been great having you on tonight to talk about, predominantly the UK and everything that's happening over there. Thank you so much for your insight. Where can people find more about you? I know you have a newsletter you put out and you do write articles and stuff like that. And of course, you got YouTube right here on the platform. So Can you kind of share a little bit about that?
Sure. So I am on YouTube as the Crusader Gal. You can search for that. I'm also on places like X, the same name, the Crusader Gal. And I write a Substack called Homefront Crusade. Really, the best way to find out more about me and my work is just to go to my website, which is like linked here, is crusadergal.com. And that way, you'll find basically all of my work. But thank you so much for having me on, Frank. It's like I said, it's always a good conversation with you. You do fabulous work, and may God continue to bless your good work. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate it, Sarah. And of course, I will link your crusadergirl.com down in the description down there. So if you guys are looking for it later, you can always find a link there. And that way you can go check her out on her various platforms. Fantastic talk tonight, Sarah. Thank you again for joining me on tonight's Freedom Stream. Hopefully you'll be back before the election. Maybe we can get together again and talk about some other stuff. Hopefully not so depressing about things that countries are
Let's
following.
hope.
But definitely got to do it again. And to everybody out there in the chat, appreciate you guys. Thank you so much. We appreciate the support. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe on the way out if you have not already done so. And shame on you if you not hit that like button. If you didn't like it, hit the thumb down twice. So until next time, we'll see you guys a little bit later. Let me get the outro out here, and we'll see you guys real soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.